And here we are, the High Renaissance and Mannerism. This is going to be a doozy of a lecture. There's just no way around it. This relatively short time period had a huge impact on the course of Western art history. And in so many ways, even to this day, we are grappling with this. So strap yourself in. Welcome aboard. So let's clarify these two distinct kind of periods of art in a way. The High Renaissance was the apex of Renaissance ideals that we introduced in the last chapter. It's classicism in its truest expression, where artists emulated rather than imitated the classical precedents that they were so influenced by. And those, of course, came from the classical era, particularly the Greeks and the Romans. Clarity was emphasized, reason, and an idealized beauty. The idea that hidden truths of the universe were revealed in nature, and the artists of the High Renaissance tried to capture those truths. Mannerism is sort of imperfect as a term, and it has different meanings for different people. But one thing that is kind of agreed upon is that it's sort of an outgrowth of the Renaissance. It features more individual styles of art. And in a way, it's a liberation from the rules, the really pent-up, severe rules of the High Renaissance. So in that sense, it's almost like anti-classical, whereas the Renaissance embodied all these classical ideals. So think about this kind of like when we talked about the ancient Greeks, kind of like the way the Hellenistic period supplanted the classical period in ancient Greece. That's kind of what Mannerism's relationship to the High Renaissance is. We see distorted proportions, we see emotion and mystery. Interestingly, some artists, like Michelangelo is a great example of this, kind of straddle both of these distinct time periods. So our timeline in this begins in the early 1500s. And this was an age of exploration and of conquest and of colonization. The exploitation of the entire rest of the world brought loads of wealth into Europe at this time. And the papacy's power had grown radically in this time period. And the Catholic Church didn't shy away from war. Julius II even would sometimes suit up for battle. And really they were amassing a whole lot of money. And they also encouraged classical and Christian synthesis that we had been talking about since the last chapter. And they really sought out the greatest artistic geniuses of the time to rebuild Rome to its former glory. The church built great palaces and also commissioned an awful lot of art. In the High Renaissance, it wasn't good enough just to copy nature precisely like in the early Renaissance. An artist must find a universal ideal of beauty in nature. And you see an idealizing of all the forms and harmonious proportions in everything. Think back to Pythagoras. There's an attitude that there is this perfect order in the universe and the artist just has to find it. High Renaissance works featured meticulous composition, everything planned out in exacting detail. Organizing principles of compositions based on geometric forms, which is an influence of Plato again. Anyway, a new ideal emerges from this, and that's the concept of the Renaissance man. This is one who not only works in many disciplines, but excels at them. So just saying like a jack of all trades doesn't quite cut it. It's someone who like truly excels in a wide variety of disciplines. And the desire to learn was everywhere. Leonardo da Vinci was a man that exemplified this ideal. And I think a lot of people see him as sort of the father of the High Renaissance. He was a bit older than many of the other major figures of the time, and he was widely admired in his time as well, still today, of course, and had a huge influence on artists of his day. He was a painter, a sculptor, an architect, a musician, a scientist, a mathematician, engineer, inventor, anatomist, geologist, cartographer, botanist, and writer. And he had a passionate interest in everything. He was so caught up in his ideas that he rarely actually followed them through. He was always moving on to something new, always drawing people on the street. Sometimes he would follow them around for hours, studying them intently. Imagine it might come across as a little creepy. Leonardo kept meticulous notebooks and wrote his notes backwards. One assumes, like, I guess so people can like look over his shoulder and copy him. He made designs for things like airplanes, helicopters, and this is in the 1500s, and even designed a parachute in case something happened while you were in your airplane. Magnificently ahead of his time. In his quest for knowledge, he would even cut up cadavers to study their inner workings of the human body. Here's an example of the Vitruvian Man, this iconic illustration of the Neoplatonic attitude of the High Renaissance. Here we see more of his notebook drawings and notes. We see, the baby in the womb, meticulous descriptions of parts of the skeleton. But for all his exploits, Leonardo is most famous for painting. In Madonna of the Rocks, we see the Virgin Mary emerging from the mists of a dark world. There's a sort of 3D pyramid structure to the composition with the way the figures are arranged, this stable, kind of bottom-heavy compositional device. But yet we also see a real delicate sense of light and shade and a unified representation of objects in this atmospheric setting. And there's an ethereal quality to it. The term sfumato refers to the glazing of semi-transparent layers on top of one another to create this almost kind of smoky look you can see throughout the composition, particularly in the negative space. We also see a real interest in chiaroscuro with the works of Leonardo da Vinci. Maybe his most iconic painting, although there's a lot to choose from, The Last Supper. This is just before Christ's arrest. The whole body is the bread and the wine is the blood bit, where he tells his disciples, "One of you will betray me." And the painting depicts this scene where at that moment where that causes a commotion among his followers. In general, Renaissance artists were known to experiment with materials, and that led to a whole lot of great discoveries. But they didn't always work out. And it didn't really work out in this case in terms of his use of the materials. He tried to create his own medium for this, and it started falling apart almost immediately upon painting it. But it's a great painting nonetheless. Perhaps its most striking achievement is the unification of architectural setting and dramatic tension. The personalities of each of the characters are portrayed. Notice Judas leaning back with the bag of money. And these figures are grouped in threes. And they are interlinked by gestures. And there's an implied line from the gaze of the figures in the painting that lead the viewer's eye throughout the composition. And there's symbolism in the use of light, along with the use of linear perspective to compose the scene. All the orthogonals point towards the head of Jesus, and it creates this symbolic focal point. His head is like the sun, and these rays emanate from it. And there's even a subtle form of a halo in the arch above. It's a little hard to see in this particular slide. And the linear perspective isn't just something for symbolic effect or even to create spatial believability. It also makes the spacing on the table believable. When we block out the top portion, the figures look entirely too packed together to make any sense. But by opening up the space behind the table through linear perspective, it becomes this unlikely scene where all of these people are all sitting on one side of the table, becomes a lot more convincing. They can breathe. And this painting that hardly even bears mentioning, it's so ubiquitous in popular culture. Mona Lisa is perhaps the most well-known work of art in history. Its outsized regard makes it a truly iconic image, and some might say contributes to an exaggeration of its quality as a painting. I mean, it's a great painting, but there are a lot of great paintings. Why is this considered so special? Certainly there's the hype, which plenty of psychologists have studied, the way people, hearing about things over and over again can affect your perception of its quality. But there is also, sort of a mystery to the work that makes it beguiling. Regardless, it's demonstrably incredible in its cultural significance. That alone is something that later artists would exploit to their own means over and over and over again. And again and again. And of course, a big part of the mysterious feeling of the painting comes from the subtly blended areas of color that we talked about earlier, called sfumato. Here we see it creating a sense of atmospheric perspective in this detail of the background, receding far into space, and we see it in the softness of the detail shot of the figure of Mona Lisa. Next up is Raphael Sanzio, or more commonly, just Raphael. Raphael's maybe my favorite of all the high Renaissance artists. It was a tragic story because he died at such a young age. Who knows what he might have accomplished if he had lived as long as the more famous Leonardo and Michelangelo. By all accounts, he was a nice guy, friendly and outgoing, in particular contrast with Michelangelo, we'll talk about next. But Raphael was truly the epitome of high Renaissance classical humanism. He was very prolific in his short life and most famous for his paintings, and his paintings featured very ordered and open compositions, even in his most ambitious work. Here is Madonna of the Meadow, from around 1505. We see this triangular symmetry, this clearly ordered composition like I'm talking about, these wide open areas, and this whole painting, the whole composition is just clean and plain. The imagery is very clear, and it's a very straightforward use of iconography. It embodies all the clarity and reason of the Renaissance tradition. But then his masterpiece, the incredibly ambitious, radically ambitious School of Athens from around 1509 to 1511. Massively scaled painting, a fresco that was really the culmination of the classical spirit of the High Renaissance. This whole painting was a sort of like a fictional depiction of the concept of philosophy. We see here with this diagram the way Raphael uses one-point linear perspective to order the composition and to set things out in a believable sense of space. This painting was an amalgamation of different historical and contemporary figures. And so each of the characters was the depiction of a contemporary to Raphael that was symbolic of an ancient, usually philosopher. And so this is what is so like fascinating about the not just the clarity but the complexity of Raphael's work. You see in the very middle of the painting, number 14 and 15 there, we see Plato in the guise of Leonardo da Vinci, and then we see next to him a depiction of Aristotle, and Plato's pointing up, pointing toward the heavens or the spiritual realm that Plato's philosophy was so concerned with, where Aristotle pointing down to the earth, the earthly. Aristotle was the first person who categorized everything on the planet and tried to organize our empirical experience of the physical world. And the two, Plato and Aristotle, were so really provide the foundation for all of Western thought. This was indicative, I think, of how self-conscious the greatness of the high Renaissance artists were, self-conscious of their greatness. They saw themselves in the same league as the classical Greeks that they so admired and sought to emulate. This also follows the tradition of prefiguration, only in non-religious terms, something that we'll talk more about a little later. This idea of thinking about the past as a way to kind of become analogous to the future. And really interesting, I think, in the way that Raphael kind of comes across as sort of self-deprecating, he includes himself in the painting, but instead of being like one of the central characters like Plato, or like this brooding Michelangelo as Heraclitus in the middle here. His two biggest like kind of real contemporary equals were Michelangelo number 13 and Plato number 14. But Raphael includes himself like way to the far right hand side on this diagram here with the letter R, and Raphael is kind of staring out at us, the viewer, way off to the right, sort of a position of insignificance. And next is Michelangelo, likely the most accomplished of all the high Renaissance artists, and he outlived most of his contemporaries. And in fact, his late work is not even considered Renaissance, but instead considered part of the Mannerism tradition. We'll talk about that a little later. Michelangelo had a stormy personality. He was always brooding. He was difficult to get along with. He thought of himself as a sculptor primarily, but he was accomplished in painting and architecture in just a significant way, if not more so. And he was also a great poet, and well, just like the Renaissance tradition of being, excelling at all these different disciplines. The thing that set Michelangelo apart from figures like Leonardo or Raphael was his obsession with the human form. He wasn't quite as compelled by mathematical principles like Raphael or Leonardo would have been, but he was concerned as what the artist's intuitive eye would see. And he also saw the physical body as a physical manifestation of the soul. And you can see that in his work. Here's a Pieta by Michelangelo. To my mind, maybe his most accomplished sculpture. This is really about the visual relationship between Christ and Mary. Here we see the scene of this mourning mother for her child. But it's interesting the way that they really kind of blend together emotionally and formally into this kind of serene, peaceful mourning. They are depicted here at like roughly the same age, which is one very big kind of distinct imprint onto the story. And they also become like a single mass, these bodies together. there's stunning naturalism in the surfaces of the marble, with exceedingly delicate curves and very convincing fabric. But what's really interesting to me is this particular kind of sadness that Michelangelo achieves with this sculpture. There's peace and harmony within this that coexists with the mourning and the grief. It's kind of a comforting kind of sadness, a serenity. Consider this like in conjunction with some earlier pietas that you might have seen in the book, where there's like kind of a harshness or a brutality to it. Even think back to Giotto's painting, The Lamentation, where we see the intense grief and suffering in the eyes of Mary. In the High Renaissance, one of the most valued ideals was a sense of calmness and rationality and reason. And so this particular type of suffering that's quiet, that's calm, it's perfectly in line with Renaissance ideals. But how does he achieve this? There's one important thing that Michelangelo does here that's kind of mind-blowing once you like really stop to look at it. But he manipulates the proportions of these figures in a radical way. It's done in a radical way that's almost so obscured by the technique of the sculpting that and the nuance and the believability of the forms, that you almost don't even notice that. Well, imagine if Mary stood up and if Jesus stood up here. Mary would be like a giant. She'd be like 10 feet tall compared to this little Jesus. Why does Michelangelo do this? Imagine this scene played out like in a realistic setting. And remember the difference between realism and representational, imagery. I would make the point here. This isn't realism at all. It's very convincing, and when you look at the forms, they almost come to life. So it's highly representational, but it's not real. Just look at the scale. It's this idealized form of reality that enhances the comfort and the peacefulness of the scene. If this were a real life situation, if it was a real woman and a real man, and he was in her lap, it would be like just imagine how the sense of discomfort of that. A full grown man like lying in a woman's lap. It would be heavy. It would be Michelangelo takes these liberties with the proportion in order to enhance the serenity of this scene, and it results in a very beautiful and moving sculpture. But of course, this is the sculpture that Michelangelo is most known for, David. It's 17 feet tall, larger than life monumental sculpture. And it was done when he was only 26 years old. This is done in a very classical style. It could practically be a Greek sculpture. Well, not really, but it was this intense naturalism. The subject, this young athletic male, lone figure, even this little tree trunk in his acknowledgement to setting, and this extreme contrapposto stance, like all these things that are utterly classical in nature. By classical, I mean the classical period of ancient Greece. But in some aspects, this is unclassical. For one thing, it embodies this personal style of Michelangelo that has to do with the human figure. There's this subtle exaggeration of body parts. Like, look at the size of the hands. The veins and the musculature are emphasized. And there's this building tension in the work. And in that way, as much as it's like classical, it almost is a little similar to Hellenistic sculpture. And this might be like kind of a hint at this coming Mannerist style that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Michelangelo used a marble block for this project that had been rejected by other artists because of damage that it looked like it had. And this really shows the confidence of young Michelangelo, and he was nothing if not confident. One thing we don't really often think about now, so removed from the original context, is the intense political content in this sculpture. This symbolized the civil liberties of the Florentine Republic, which was under threat from larger political entities at the time. And this, of course, the symbolism is David, killing Goliath, which is Goliath was like the much more powerful Rome that threatened Florence, and so that also made this politically charged sculpture very controversial when it was unveiled, and it was greeted by stone throwing rioters upon its unveiling. And then later on, later on, its genitals were covered with a metal loincloth for a while. Interesting. But compare Michelangelo's high Renaissance David to Donatello's early Renaissance David, and here you can see, like the much more specific attention to the detail and the musculature, also the scale. Donatello's David was like more or less life size, but Michelangelo's was massive in scale. But Michelangelo's crowning achievement was not even sculpture, which is what he really probably would have liked to be remembered the most for. But no, it was the Sistine Chapel. And there's a link in the Canvas site to a really interesting page you should look at about the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo didn't want to paint this. He was sort of coerced into doing it. And he argued with, coerced by the Pope. And he argued with the Pope, but eventually he had to relent. Because as powerful of a force Michelangelo was, he was not the Pope. This was a huge undertaking. And he led on to everyone who was within earshot that he hated every minute of doing it. Imagine spending 4 years of your life, kind of lying upside down on the scaffolding, and with it's fresco painting, so he's working with lime and plaster. Imagine this stuff dripping into your face as you're working, directly above yourself. And this painting might have been responsible for ruining his eyesight. What we see in this incredibly complex work of art here are depictions of Old Testament stories alongside images from Greek mythology. Again, this fusion of Christian tradition and classical tradition. And in this way, he was using the Greeks and Greek mythology as sort of a prefiguration to the Christian story along with the Old Testament. There are, in the center, there are 9 kind of made Old Testament narratives and presented in reverse chronological order. Let's look at one. And if we're going to look at one, this would be the obvious choice, the creation of Adam. This represents that spark of life into the lifeless. And this also has a connection with Greek mythology. And in that sense, again, this kind of fusion between the pagan and the Christian, found a really interesting implied line. And this is, kind of like Mona Lisa. A lot of these works from the High Renaissance are such important icons in our culture that it's impossible to not have seen this replicated in all sorts of different, later uses by artists, by marketing people and advertising, you name it. Thus far, in our discussion about the High Renaissance, we focused mostly on Florence and Rome. And the two together, even though they might have been often politically at odds, had the same kind of general bent towards them. They were very philosophical. They were really concerned with line and structure and clarity. Um, but there was another kind of center of influence in Italy during the High Renaissance, and that was Venice. Um, Venice was located right on the water, and a lot of people speculate that had something to do with the way that the artists like perceived light. Um, in fact, their work was much more about color and light and this diffused sense of light than it was about clarity or structure or line. The Venetians also had an intense love of landscape, and we see landscape occurring in their work in a much more prominent way than with Florence and Rome. Their work was also, I guess if the Florence and Rome artists were like distinctly philosophical in their approach, the Venetians were much more poetic in their work. It was about pleasure, it was about color, it was about mystery. Certain aspects about the culture in Venice that might, set them apart. In addition to being located on the water, there was also this sort of what's called the myth of Venice that had to do with its political stability, as opposed to the real, contentious and volatile situation in Florence and Rome. Venice felt that their style of government and their location left them invincible, and they saw themselves as the true new Rome, as opposed to Rome. And this perhaps gave a certain kind of psychological bravado to their artists. So consequently, there was a real rivalry between these two kind of schools of thought regarding artists from Venice versus Rome and Florence, like the East Coast, West Coast rapper feud. The main battle was a disagreement over the heart of painting. What was it all about? Was it about drawing in chiaroscuro, as represented by Leonardo and Raphael and Botticelli's Disegno? Or was it about color and brushwork, colorito, by artists like Titian and Giorgione? Draftsmanship or color? Which is more important in a painting? I have my own personal views on that as a painter, but maybe I'll keep them to myself. Here is Sleeping Venus by Giorgione, done at the end of Giorgione's life. In fact, the sky was finished by Titian, who was his assistant. We see this common convention in painting as woman as landscape. It was a common theme at the time, and went on to become a common theme all throughout the rest of art history. And with this repetition of these curving forms, and the figure here, kind of similar to some of the classical Greek sculpture, especially the late classical Greek sculpture, is sort of dreamily erotic. It's not like overtly sexual, but you see this soft, kind of subtle, languishing. We see the exposed armpit that was probably at the time the most arousing thing, but also her hand just gently kind of touching her genitals, not in any kind of active way, but just again like kind of just softly erotic kind of way. But this established a precedent for reclining nude that we see again like all throughout art history. So it's not just like the female form as landscape. As we said, it's also the landscape itself that was very interesting to the Venetian painters. It starts to become the subject of the work as much as the figure is. And this is an area that the Venetians really pioneered. So why were the Venetians so interested in landscape and influenced by color? Of course, like we said before, that Venice is on the water, and one thing that creates is this changing light conditions at all different parts of the day. And that those changing light conditions were exacerbated by the reflecting light off the canals. And that becomes a part of their everyday experience. And so they were really aware of this changing sense of light, kind of like much later on the Impressionists would be. But also, there was this development of oil paint and its capacity for glazing. And that's something that the Venetians, really embraced, was building up thin layers of transparent color, where the light can penetrate through the uppermost paint layers to the canvas and then bounce off the canvas and pass through these layers again out to the viewer. And this created an unprecedented luminosity in the surface of the paint. So this kind of magic, this emanating light from the canvas isn't really something that translates on a computer monitor or a projection screen or in a book for that matter. It's something you kind of have to see the actual thing to be wowed by that. But this technique encouraged a loosening of the brushwork, whereas the Florentine and Rome, and artists from Rome, often painted kind of tight. Not so much Leonardo, but painted relatively tight. The Venetians started like blending and stacking marks on top of one another. And in this way, the image was sort of liberated from a sharp delineation. We see edges that sort of get lost into the environment they're in. And that too creates this real heightened sense of believability where the paintings just come to life off of the canvas. You can see in this detail shot of the picture and the arm and the hips, you can see areas where the edge just kind of fades away into the background, which is what happens when you look at objects in the real world. And it's this softness and the sense of restraint that creates this magical experience in the painting. The brushwork and soft layers of translucent color permeate the whole painting rather than a clearly delineated, almost outlined edge that you might have seen with Raphael. That brings us to the real titan of Venetian painters, and that's Titian. I guess that was pretty bad alliteration there. Titian was the most important of the Venetian school painters. He lived a very long life, and just like his biggest rival from Rome, which was Michelangelo, and his subject matter was widely varied. He often employed loose brushwork with bold, rich color and daring compositions. This is Venus of Urbino, another large-scale painting, oil on canvas. And we see here one of the things that Titian was known for was the very interesting division of space within the composition of his paintings. We see here these kind of like receding kind of rectangles, the smaller units as the space recedes away from the viewer. This painting follows certain conventions established for nudes by this time, but it was very different in one important way. Whereas Giorgione's painting we looked at a little bit ago was like kind of, softly erotic. Here, Titian gives us a painting that is much more actively erotic. The subject is wide awake, and not only awake, but staring straight at the viewer, almost in this like, almost an uncomfortable kind of way. Is she a prostitute? Maybe, or maybe this is a marital bed, and maybe on the night of the wedding, and the viewer is like the husband. Either way, there's a sense of mystery to this, and it's a striking painting. In these detail shots, you can see not only this like kind of overtly seductive kind of gaze, but you also, even more importantly, you see the blending of paint layers that creates this softness of the skin. compare this to the earlier Botticelli's, Birth of Venus. The imagery is somewhat similar, but utterly different in terms of the use of surface, the use of the softness of the paint to create this, to like bring the surface of the skin to life. Look at how clearly delineated Botticelli's painting is with these outlines that kind of flatten the form, whereas Titian, this figure just almost just like floats off of the canvas into the space in front of you. Incredibly more lifelike feeling and look. Another set of detail shots here between the two artists, that really illustrate the difference between these two schools of painting. But the high times of the Renaissance eventually came to an end, and the period that we talk about as sort of kind of Renaissance, but very clearly not, is Mannerism. Mannerism spans most of the 16th century, and as a broad delineation of a stylistic kind of difference, it's like silly to kind of have with any of these periods, like having a firm start date is kind of ridiculous. However, 1520 is a good starting point for this, because marks the death of Raphael in 1520. And it's kind of, if you're going to create a division, that's a really good division between, because Mannerism was sort of like the anti-Raphael. And then it ends when the 1500s ends. But this is a time of severe turmoil in Italy. Rome is sacked by the Spanish in 1527. It's in shambles, and the extravagance of papal patronage is gone. But maybe even more important than that was the Reformation and the subsequent Counter-Reformation that really split all of Europe in two. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 gripes about the papacy to a church door. What did he complain about? Well, materialism was a biggie, especially the sale of indulgences. This was where wealthy donors could buy remission of punishment for their sins, sort of like a get out of purgatory free card, which is a great way to raise funds. And it did pay for a lot of Renaissance art, just saying. But one could see that it might come across as a bit corrupt. He also said the Bible was the only true source of divine knowledge, so there was no real need for the church as intermediary between God and man. Well, as maybe would be predictable, he got excommunicated by the church and condemned by Charles V, the guy who invaded Rome. But a whole movement grew up around him, and it was particularly popular in Northern Europe, which became predominantly Protestant, which was what this branch of Christianity became referred to as Protestant. Although to see it as a singular thing, I think, is a misunderstanding. It was kind of like more like a whole bunch of different things, but in the way that it was going against the universal Catholic Church, it kind of splits Europe into kind of two camps in that sense. Interestingly, there was a real severe backlash against classical humanism, not just from the Protestants, but once the Reformation started happening, it came from both sides, the Protestants and the Catholics. Once again, just like in the Middle Ages, there was this harsh view of God as enforcer rather than savior that was prevalent among people. And the split marked the end of the church's participation in scientific and cultural developments in the West, which is tragic. From then on, culture and science are almost always met with animosity from both Catholic and Protestant sides, arguably up to this day. Consider the culture wars that are so prominent in our political and social settings. So the Reformation took its strongest hold in the north. The papacy remained strong in the south. And the Catholic Church didn't just sit around to watch the Reformation happen, hence the Counter-Reformation, which was a backlash against the Protestant Reformation. One real positive thing about it was it ushered in a whole round of reforms to the Catholic Church, where they really made an effort to eliminate corruption and to provide better education for priests, to make them better priests. But then there was also the Spanish Inquisition to find and punish heretics. At this time that meant Protestants as well as Jews or Muslims. And it also meant the censorship of all non-Catholic thought. Any art that was not matching Catholic doctrine was not permitted. So art not only it should extol moral themes, it should also appeal to the miraculous and one's emotion rather than reason, which was, as anti-humanist as you can get. Even Michelangelo was brought before the Inquisition. So why focus on the miraculous? Well, one thing that the Catholic Church specifically wanted to do in the Counter-Reformation was to re-emphasize the mystery of the faith. Where the Lutherans tried to strip away the mystery and said you could read the Bible yourself without the intermediary of the church, the church really wanted to exert its authority and really wanted itself to be necessary. So this is a very difficult and tumultuous time, and it's reflected in the arts. So Mannerism really was the Counter-Reformation style. There's no clean stylistic designation. There's different, sometimes conflicting meanings about what Mannerism is to different people. But there are a couple things that typify it, though. Usually there's a sense of elegance about the work. There's a celebration of artifice or the surface. There was often elongated human figures. Kind of seems weird. The compositions are generally very complex, and there was often an inclusion of obscure iconography that was really difficult to read and kind of perpetuated a sense of mystery. The audience for Mannerist art was typically courtly patronage as well as the church, and so it was a somewhat elitist audience. Perhaps ironically, the imagery was often consciously erotic, but at the same time, most of the work was dogmatically religious in nature. And in so many ways, Mannerism was in stark contrast to Renaissance. And here's a handy chart to help you differentiate between the two. The Renaissance on one side was about substance, where Mannerism was about artifice, or the surface meaning rather than looking deeper. The Renaissance looked to nature for inspiration, where Mannerism looked to previous artworks as inspiration. The Renaissance involved these idealized figures, kind of like classical Greece, that idealized sense of beauty, whereas Mannerists often contorted natural forms for effect. In the Renaissance, the work was about simplicity and clarity, where in Mannerism it was complex arrangements of forms. The Renaissance had stable, open compositions, while Mannerist compositions were generally crowded and unstable. The Renaissance was calm, refined, and rational, where Mannerism featured exaggerated gestures of figures and was anything but rational. Ironically, two of the biggest giants of high Renaissance art eventually were considered Mannerists. Michelangelo's style became Mannerist overtly toward the end of his life, and even Titian could also be seen as Mannerist later in his life. Jacopo da Pontormo, Descent from the Cross. In this painting, we see a depiction of Christ being taken down from the cross, which is a very common Mannerist subject that was painted very often. We see contorted bodies in anatomically impossible positions. Look at the figure at the bottom, holding the legs of Jesus. Like there's no way that his shoulder could be there if his head is there and his back is there, which is a feature of a lot of Mannerist art. We also see this very interesting kind of sense of color, this very unnatural sense of color, this gray pallor of death, and these unlikely pinks and blues throughout the entire composition. We see Mary falling backwards in grief, sort of fainting like a southern belle, very emotional. And we see this limp, lifeless, almost hunk of meat of Jesus. And all the other figures that are active, moving, twisting, and turning. But Jesus and Mary are kind of removed from the frenzy. It's kind of interesting. And interesting also is this void in the center, in the exact center of the composition where you might expect kind of, some kind of focal point. We see no faces. No figures right there, which is kind of intriguing. And it's a very strange juxtaposition between the gloomy background and then the really bright, vibrant, happy colors. A very odd painting, which makes it a great example of Mannerist art. And here's, a similar sort of painting by Rosso Fiorentino, Descent from the Cross. Notice the emptiness of the sky, and also notice the wind blowing the garments on towards the top of the painting for dramatic effect. Almost like you can imagine like in a cheesy movie having a fan blowing the actor's hair. Everything is infused with melodrama. And probably my favorite Mannerist painting by Bronzino, the Allegory of Venus, also referred to as Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time. This is an allegorical painting about lust, deceit, and jealousy. But what does it really mean? Who knows? And that's part of its appeal. And this also is sort of, on one hand, typifies Mannerist painting, but on the other hand, it's certainly an exception to the dogmatic Christian imagery rule of Mannerism. We see Roman mythology here instead. And we see Venus and Cupid in the foreground. And you might remember that Cupid is the son of Venus. So there's a little bit of like kind of Oedipus incest going on. Folly is the puto, that little kind of childlike angelic creature that strides forward with a deviant look in his eyes. The putos were young naked child, usually with wings, but not here. It's a classical image, meant to help facilitate the onset of romantic love. And the old man in the upper right is time, and envy is the old woman pulling out her hair. And then if you look really carefully behind Cupid, behind Folly, not Cupid, is this like snake girl. And look at where her head is compared to her body. It makes no anatomical sense at all. And then there's Oblivion, the figure in the upper left, across from Time, holding the drapery, maybe trying to cover up this heinous act. This piece was done for courtly patronage, obviously not for the church. And, as we talked about with Mannerist painting, there's this very crowded sense of space, this serpentina pose on the figures, this elongation of Cupid's neck. Here's a detail shot. See a little tongue. And the figure of envy, an old woman screaming in pain, sometimes read as syphilis. Watch out, this maybe is a cautionary tale. Next we have Parmigianino, Madonna with the long neck. This, of course, features these very odd spatial situations. Like what's with that little miniature man on the lower right? Very odd perceptual proportional things going on. And extreme manipulations of proportions. The long legs, the short torso of the figure on the left holding the jug. Just a weird, disorienting scene. But also one with an amazing amount of attention to detail. So as odd as the spatial proportions are, the detail is very specific. And so that kind of creates a kind of interesting tension or paradox. And then this masterpiece of scale and ambition, Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco from 1536 to 1541. This is on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. And this was painted long after he did the ceiling. In fact, there's a 20-year span between the two. And so it reflects the rapidly changing style of Mannerism as it supplanted the High Renaissance. And this depicts the second coming and eternal judgment of humanity. It's a very controversial painting, and in it, Michelangelo is sort of flaunting his individualist style. The composition sort of swirls around the central element of Jesus sitting in judgment. There's an overwhelming figurative and spatial complexity in the work. Exaggerated musculature of the human forms and intense emotion. St. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, is in the detail on the upper left-hand side of the slide. He was a Christian martyr who, by one account, was skinned alive. Here he holds his own skin in his hand along with a knife, and the face on the skin is likely a portrait of Michelangelo himself. He was in his 60s when this painting was finished, and there's speculation that St. Bartholomew is a reference to his own mortality. As this was being painted, the whole shebang, a higher up in the church complained about it, about the way Michelangelo was making it, and consequently, Michelangelo paints him in as Minos, the judge of the underworld. Here on the lower right-hand side, you see him wrapped in a serpent, and then this individual really complains. But the Pope was kind of a friend of Michelangelo's and said that his jurisdiction didn't extend into hell, so the portrait would have to stay. Let's next talk about High Renaissance and Mannerist architecture. And one indicative feature is the influence of Neoplatonism. We talked about Plato, we talked about the theory of the forms, and this idea of a circle format for churches was common, similar to the Byzantine style long ago. Because the circle was the most perfect of the forms, and that association of that perfection is with the divine. And so we see centrally planned spaces more in accordance with nature. You see the circle everywhere, ripples on water, and the circle is like unity because it's symmetrical on all sides simultaneously. This is New St. Peter's Cathedral, commissioned by Pope Julius II, and it was designed by Bramante, Raphael, and Michelangelo. It's like a who's who list of High Renaissance architects, though it took quite a while to actually build because the architects working on it kept dying. Another nod to the Neoplatonic classicism in architecture of the High Renaissance is the Villa Rotonda. And you can see here the plan of the circle inside the square, inside the larger square. But this kind of unity of forms was something that the High Renaissance architects were really influenced by. Here it is next to the Pantheon, and you can see the clear influence. And as we're going to talk about a little later on in the semester, this influence of the classical era was intense during the High Renaissance, but it also found a resurgence later on during the neoclassical period, which happens to be a time in which the United States of America was founded as a country. And so a lot of the central figures of that time period were greatly influenced by the Renaissance, in turn, the classical era. And so we have buildings like Monticello here by Thomas Jefferson, which too is influenced by the Villa Rotonda and the then earlier classical architecture. So that concludes our lecture on the High Renaissance and Mannerism. And thank you for your patience in a long lecture. I haven't seen how long it is yet, but I suspect it's pretty long. Next up, we will see what comes next, and have a great evening.